have chosen a subject this morning that comes rather closely into the lives of all of us. And that is the problem of the human will. We all have within us the will to do something, to be something, to compete in some way with the society of which we are a part. And usually, the energy of the will is employed to sustain such purposes, convictions, attitudes, and beliefs as we already possess, or to which we have some formal addiction. Thus we are constantly energizing desires, energizing wishes and hopes, and negatively, energizing fears and doubts. The will, therefore, has among its most basic qualities a strange, subtle, psychological determination to justify itself. And the average person is rather strongly possessed with this determination. For most of us, the desire or determination to justify can get us into many difficulties. For until we learn only to justify that which is true, or that which is right, or that which is good, all these efforts to sustain our position on some point of debate or on some concept of life, such efforts can bring with them only additional complications, more trouble, more difficulty, more suffering. And in all of this, while it sounds rather heartless and it's a little difficult to accept, we have to realize that nearly any situation in which we find ourselves is the result of our own determination to be there. This, perhaps we would not like to acknowledge. Our determination, so far as we can diagnose it, has not ever been to suffer. Yet if our determination is set in patterns which can only produce suffering, then we, at least in an indirect manner, have determined to suffer. A common example of our problem lies in the individual who does not know how to restrain his speed instinct while driving a car. Today we know from every evidence, from report, and from constant reminder that driving above a certain rate of speed is not safe on our highways, or should perhaps be said, is more dangerous than normal driving. Yet there are a great many persons whose determination will not permit them to accept this code. They are resolved to drive as they please. When an accident results, the problem is always to shift the blame. The mechanism is defective. The other car should not have been there. Yet the truth of the matter is that the individual who violated what he knows to be a reasonable code is responsible for his trouble. And as in speeding, so in many other things, all around us in society, we are in the presence of examples of what happens when we violate basic principles, or when we go contrary to rules which have been proven through the ages. Therefore, any individual who is not so completely illiterate as to be unable to read the danger signs, or so completely infantile as not to be able to interpret them, all others are self-responsible. This is true when troubles rise in the home, or difficulties arise in business, or when our social problems become complicated. Nearly always these complications result from the individual's will to act contrary to a pattern, or to break the rules of the society of which he is a part. This, however, leads to an inevitable modification and further thoughtfulness. Nearly all progress in history has resulted from the constructive breaking of man-made rules in favor of universal laws. In other words, the individual grows because he determines to make a better rule for living. As he is vulnerable, and as so often this person, in his effort to change the course of history or of society or of culture or of the faiths of nations, this individual overlooks the fact that it is easier to eliminate him than it is for him to change the countless persons whom he can never even personally know. Therefore, wherever these large motions of change come in, we have an almost unbroken record of martyrdom. The leader, be he good or bad, in the exercise of his determination or his will to accomplish certain ends, opens himself to the animosities of those around him, and therefore must expect a certain measure of persecution. Under such conditions, however, he must realize, as we all must realize, that allegiance to principles and a complete dedication of will, life, and energy to concepts that are not prevailing and are therefore minority viewpoints, that such a decision is our own. No one forces us to make it. No one insists that we do it. It is a voluntary commitment of a life to a purpose. This voluntary commitment, therefore, relieves society of the responsibility of the consequences, in this sense, that whatever then happens is the result of our own decision, and not primarily of the occurrences that take place around us. If we choose a dangerous path because we consider that path to be important, if we consider that path to be so real, so vital, and so necessary, that in the cause of it we are willing to sacrifice life, liberty, and honor, then we must not complain if that sacrifice or those sacrifices must be made. Again, they are the voluntary decision of the individual. So whatever happens comes from our own decision. We may decide that the things we desire to do are so valuable, so necessary, and so good, that if we have to suffer to do them, it is still worthwhile. Under such conditions, however, we must not resent the inevitable suffering. We must accept it as part of the job, of the thing we have decided to do. Consequently, for better or for worse, the decisions which the person makes, he must be willing to carry. And he must carry them with whatever dignity these decisions demand. He cannot, having decided upon a certain course, then be sorry for himself the rest of his life. He cannot then turn upon society considering it to be an evil, horrible monster because it disagrees with him. He has chosen. He has chosen, fully realizing that society will disagree with him. Therefore, this disagreement is to be expected. It is not a tragedy. It is not something about which we should complain. We have made the decision. And in each case in life, the places we find ourselves are the results of decisions or indecisions of one kind or another. Indecision can also bring with it a heavy burden of misfortune. The individual who has not the courage of some conviction must suffer for lack of conviction. These things we know. It is unfortunate that they are not more generally taught on those levels of education where life is beginning to form patterns. We should know from the beginning that the inalienable right that we have to be a person is shared by all others. And if we consider it a virtue to disagree with others, they may consider it a virtue to disagree with us. And until we are able to live in that kind of a world, we will have great difficulty in adjusting socially or personally or economically. On the other hand, a great deal depends upon the attitude with which the will attacks a problem. A great many persons have accomplished more due to temperament or personality than others. Some individuals find in the will a constant source of irritation, and as a result, those around them are continuously reminded that the willful individual has an unpleasant nature. There are others whose will to accomplish is presented in such magnificent and sympathetic terms that even those comparatively disinterested or certainly uninterested have still a kindly and constructive reaction because of the obvious and inevitable sincerity of the person who is attempting to accomplish a certain end. Thus, friendliness, when united with will, advances causes, but belligerence defeats causes. And the person whose determination is gracious often has more friends than enemies and is better respected, even though he may differ from those around him. The art of differing pleasantly is a sure sign of a degree of genius. We can all differ from people, but very often it ends only in a bitter argument or a deep misunderstanding. To be able to be ourselves, to be true to our principles, and accomplish this with the least offense to others, is a gracious and wonderful talent. Actually, it is a perfectly reasonable talent, because other people are not responsible for what we decide to do. Therefore, we should not punish them for their non-cooperation. Rather, we should not expect more than we ourselves would give in like condition, and should be grateful for help because it is unexpected, and patient under criticism because it is to be expected. Usually, it is the reverse, and we lack this wonderful sensitivity which enables us to present the cause which we wish to represent in a manner and in a light that creates a kindly reaction. Will, generally speaking, does not create kindly reaction because of the pressures that move behind it. The willful person is determined to accomplish his end, and he is usually perfectly willing to be a little ruthless in some way. Perhaps he does not mean to be. Perhaps he expects others to understand his true motives, and is terribly disappointed when they do not. Yet it is hard for others to understand us if we are ruthless, if we are cruel or unkind, even if our cause be just. For there is a certain something lurking in the heart of man that tells him that just causes should be kind, and that the difference between truth and error lies somewhere in the beauty, patience, and understanding of truth. So always in the development of will patterns, we call upon the total aggregate of our personality and disposition to give us the means for accomplishing that which we will to accomplish. If, therefore, the person as a total being is comparatively unenlightened, the methods used to attain ends will be unenlightened. Whereas if the person as a total being has certain attainments within himself, his purposes will be achieved within the pattern of his own convictions, which will be enlightened. All these things also tell us why, under many occasions, we do not gain the cooperation and understanding which we hope for. The most common reason is that the individual is not a good example of the conviction to which he is addicted. Instead of being a proof that this conviction makes life better, he is more likely to be a proof that this conviction makes life contentious, disagreeable, unreasonable, and perhaps even unfair. Under such example, the other person is not greatly impressed, nor does he learn to love the ideas which are so important to us. Will being dry. Will never drives harder than in the face of obstacles. And as we have described before, this world is made up of over 2 billion human beings, each one a source of will energy radiant from himself, and each one an obstacle to all the others. Each individual who releases a determination from himself releases it into a field of counter-determinations. All other people have determinations also, and like as not, they are not the same as ours. Therefore, wherever two sets of determinations meet antagonistically and clash, we have a little battlefield of some kind. And these small battlefields, mingling together into the greater patterns of our various intensities, create wars and situations in society that have afflicted us since the dawn of recorded history. Thus, each person, as a center of will, in order to claim the priceless heritage that he has, the right to be himself, must analyze what this right is and how he can vitalize it with will energy, and at the same time not come into conflict with the will energies of those around him. This conflict, which now even is regarded more or less as a virtue, we're supposed to be battling all the time. Some of our recent sociological writers have told us that conflict is the proof that we are alive. But conflict, if it continues long enough, will be the proof that a good many of us are dead. Because even in social conflict, it is true that no one ever won a war. there are only various degrees of losers. So this problem of will coming in conflict with other will is with us every day. Parents have it with their children. We have it in business and life. We have it whenever we pick up the newspaper and allow ourselves a broad explosion over disapproval of this or that. We all come to the conclusion that things are going badly and the world should let us straighten them out. But no one will. It is a very sad and unfortunate situation. It could only be one step worse, and that is if we were trying to do what we would like to do. We would then realize our own ineptitude. But as we never have the chance, we pass out of life with a smug conviction we could have succeeded. Actually, we sit down with ourselves and we say there are 2 billion people. Every one of these persons is born with the right to make the major decisions of his life. If people are born in groups where this right has not been established or has been forfeited, we then say that they live under autocracies or dictatorships, and that they are the victims of various overlords who deprive them of their rights. And yet here we are, living in a world like this, in which everyone has rights. And even those who have never exercised their rights, or are unable to do so as children, or as primitive peoples not yet brought to the level of self-integration, these still are not the natural victims of our intensities. Those who have rights and practice them do so and should do so with our consent. And those who have not yet voiced rights or cannot require our protection of their right to their rights, even though we may not be able to confer these. The fact that another person is weaker gives us no right to exploit that weakness for our own benefit. Thus we must face this world with rights. And among these rights must always be that of self-determinism, the right of the individual to make his own decision, whether it be correct or incorrect. To take from him this privilege is to destroy his privilege of learning. The individual who is not a free agent cannot grow, because his growth depends upon this free agency. If we have not the right of decision, we need not carry the burden of consequence. Therefore the animal, because it is incapable of decision, cannot be right or wrong. And the same is true of the small child, or of the person hopelessly mentally ill, or of those of great age or senility, or of primitive peoples who have not emerged into culture. Thus, the right of the individual to learn by his own conduct is the most precious thing in the world. And without it, the great cycles of necessity could not accomplish their proper end. Each individual who has the right to be himself also has the right to confer himself, and also to withdraw that which he has conferred. Therefore, he has the right of voluntary union with any conviction, any group, any body, which he sincerely believes to be right. Therefore, he has the right of voluntary union in worship, in policy, in education, in society, in cooperation in labor and activity. He has the right to give his will and his strength to a common pool. He also, however, has the right, if this object to which he has given his allegiance should prove unsatisfactory, unrealistic, or unreasonable, he has a right to withdraw that allegiance, because he is a person. Now, when we think about people around us, it is hard for us to take this attitude of universal citizenship into accord. The dominant husband or wife finds it hard to say of the marriage partner, this person has the right to be themselves, to make their own decisions, and to live according to the convictions of their own conscience. We theoretically know it. We would vote for it on a ticket, but we cannot practice it. We find an irresistible determination within ourselves to exercise the power of our own will over that other person, especially if that other person is either patient or weak, and therefore does not rebel and throw off whatever imposition we would attempt to work upon them. Therefore, we tyrannize most those who are weakest, which is a common fault, but also a very bad violation of code, because the individual who is weak needs strength, not tyranny. And the more an individual is deficient in decision, the more valuable it is for those who care for them to increase the decisional power of that person and not make the decision for him. Now, there are some who by nature invite us to overstep our natural rights. There are others who by their belligerence attempt to overstep our natural rights. And in all these problems of relationship, the simple fact of the individual's voluntary association should and must ultimately become the criterion of all relationships that are real. In the personal sphere of life, voluntary relationship is usually based upon friendship, respect, or love. These are the only reasons why we should sacrifice any measure of our own rights or expect others to do so. And strangely enough, nature automatically produces most of its results. And where we find, as we so often do, human relationships on the rocks or close to the danger point, we also find that friendship, respect, and love have already been compromised. We do not find the troubles existing in spite of these emotions, but rather because of the lack of them. And wherever troubles begin, it means that someone has broken the rules, and that the only way in which the situation can be remedied is for that person to realize his own mistake. Now, in an emergency of this kind, nearly everyone gets together and tries to tell him about his mistake. This does very little good, because only when we realize within ourselves the facts can we deflect this tremendous energy that we are pouring into an aggrieved situation. The basic pattern, then, that we have to recognize is that each individual must learn how to grow without interfering with the growth of others. and that any growth relationships which he has with others must be constructive, and must be constructive in the sense that they protect the right of the other person also to grow. The entire theory of competitive living, based upon the fact that a success must be bought at the price of 100 failures, or that one must succeed by taking away the rights, privileges, or livelihoods of others. This concept is essentially and basically wrong, and has never produced happiness, contentment, peace, or security individually or collectively. Now the individual then, sitting quietly in the center of his own area of will influence, and recognizing the fact that he has no right to grow by stepping on other people or climbing over them, is left on the horns of a dilemma. If he cannot take it away from someone else, where is he going to get it? And if other people do not contribute to his happiness, how is he going to be happy? And if other people are unpleasant, how is he going to keep a good disposition? And if these associations around him insist on constantly disagreeing with him, why should he not disagree with them? It is back to the old eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth approach to the entire matter. And somewhere we've got to reestimate the policies governing growth. And we have to change from our perspective from a political to a biological foundation. The great rules of growth which we see in nature are the rules that must be obeyed, not the rules for growth which we see in the passing phases of human society, for these phases are constantly changing and are nearly always proving themselves ineffective. So growth, like everything else in nature, must be based upon the universal code or the universal law of these things. And those who keep the universal law find the answer. But those who break it in favor of a man-made code lose the answer. Now, there is one other point that we have to mention here. When man decides to give his allegiance to a universal law, does this mean that he must become socially a lawbreaker in terms of man-made law? In other words, can he accept the symbol of lawlessness as a symbol of liberty? Is disrespect for the codes of his society a proof that he is a free soul? The answer is obviously no. And yet for a time it seems as though it should be the reverse. Why is the answer no? Because man-made law is a degree of the interpretation of universal law. That which is essentially sound in human law is also part of a larger code. The difficulty with man-made law is not usually that it is totally wrong. The difficulty is that it is not as far developed or perfected as the needs of certain advanced persons. Laws are made for great groups, masses of people. And in these masses there are individuals who are probably superior to the level of jurisdiction in which they exist. Lincoln was faced with this exact problem when he was asked to help the escape of runaway slaves from the South. He said he could not do it because to do so would be to break law, but that he dedicated himself to making a better law. And this was the conviction on which he lived. So wherever man in growth decides to live better than the law of society, he is never a lawbreaker. Because to live better than the law is really to pass above its jurisdiction into a state in which law and equity alone functions. And we find very few examples of individuals who have been declared lawbreakers because they were better than the law. The lawbreaker is one who disrespects or violates a level. Growth carries us above this level into a state in which our conduct is such that we will seldom, if ever, violate a man-made law. It rather carries us to the point where we begin to live under the deeper, wiser, and more loving influence of a God-made law. Thus, the growing person is not a lawbreaker. He outgrows a code through interpretation, and we have exactly the same thing in religion. There are a great many individuals who go to a church who as persons are more advanced, more understanding, and perhaps more virtuous than the clergyman they listen to. But this does not make it necessary for them to stay home. It does not even make it necessary for them to find another church. Because the individual who is growing inside himself will interpret into the words of the minister ideas that the minister never had. And the sermon will be just as deep as the need of the listener. We never find it necessary to make violent breaks as we grow, because growth gives us a constant inner enlargement of understanding, and that brings with it greater beauty of soul, greater patience, greater understanding of heart, until finally the truly enlightened person can worship anywhere, because he is worshiping truly that which is in his own soul, and any symbol can represent it. Thus, in the advance of our purposes, true growth does not usually bring with it too many agitations or inconsistencies within the life of the private citizen. It is true, of course, that great motions of integrity in society, led by unselfish, dedicated leaders, may run into great opposition and result in the martyrdom of leaders. But the average person is not in this position, nor does the problem bear directly on his personal relationships with others. He may, however, always carry within himself the realization that the principles he believes are sufficiently important so that any price that he must pay to live them is still not too much. But now we find man sitting here with a great deal of willpower and no place to go. We find him all ready to conquer something, to go out and change the course of history, and perhaps gradually recognizing the fact that he has no right to do so. Or has he? To what degree would civilization advance if individuals did not dare to go out and change the course of history? That is a moot question. We've been changing the course of history for a long time, but the course of history isn't straight yet. and the courses that we change are frequently only into further complications. It is true that there are individuals who have the endowments, the abilities, and the powers to make large personal contributions. There are also individuals whose endowments only permit a lesser but no less important sphere of influence. Thus the person sitting in the midst of his potential capacity to do and to be must somewhere educate his understanding of what he should do and what he should be. And this is one of the great problems of willpower. How many people can use it to change themselves? One of the reasons we hesitate on this course is because it isn't glamorous. We all like the experience of feeling that we are dominating something. It gives us a certain sense of strength. It also gives us a strange feeling of importance. And this feeling of importance, which is just another name for egotism, keeps us constantly striving for positions of authority. We want to be leaders. Those who have honestly and sincerely found positions of authority will be the first to say that there has been very little satisfaction in these positions. The only satisfaction comes to the person who is blind to responsibility. Those who are conscientiously administering larger works in life will be the first to admit that the little glory is more than balanced by the tremendous amount of labor, thoughtfulness, and self-sacrifice that must go into adequate administration. So leadership is a heavy burden, not a reward. But many seek it because to them it would only be an opportunity to exercise willpower over someone else. The whole pattern or program is not right. Will points out to us, if we will so accept it, that every individual is endowed by life with the energy necessary to solve the mystery of himself. He is given faculties and powers, the first duty of which is self-analysis. Not the kind of self-analysis which is merely selfishness or mere desire to find the pleasure of discovering how important we are. The real problem of self-analysis and self-development means the individual gradually attaining a condition of adequacy as a person. This takes more willpower than is required to boss an entire community. Because to achieve this end, man must exercise will in a direction in which he has seldom used it. It is like exercising muscles that have never been tried. And the first efforts at self-control result in all the pains and discomforts of an individual over-exercising unused muscles. It takes more resourcefulness, more continuity of purpose, more dedication of life to achieve self-integration than any other project that the person can attempt. Yet all legitimate fields of leadership, all fields which are true and which therefore invite the voluntary cooperation of others, must be based upon self-integration. There's no use the person saying that he's too busy helping others to watch his own step. His ability to help others is measured by his ability to administer his own consciousness. So will has one tremendous task that interferes actually with no one else, takes no one else's rights away. The individual in self-conquest can achieve in a desert, can achieve in the midst of a populous community. What others do has no effect upon this self-conquest. The individual who is gradually disciplining his own mind and heart into the rules of the way of life, which is proper, natural, and correct for man. All other things will be added to the person who achieves this use of energy. And this use of energy means, first, vigilance, then perhaps reflection and observation, the ability to accept, the individual being able to be quiet and listen when he would like to do all the talking, the individual who recognizes that it is first necessary to learn, and then comes the privilege of sharing what we know. But there is nothing to be gained by everyone going out valiantly and gloriously sharing his ignorance with everyone else. The individual who wishes to share must have reaped a harvest worth sharing. And the individual who wishes gloriously and bountifully to give must have something to give that is worth giving. Thus our power, our right to be understood, received, and respected depends entirely upon our own willingness to integrate around a core of integrities and to gradually modify all attitudes which are themselves unreasonable, belligerent, combative, competitive. Now this does not mean necessarily that we give up strength, because strength lies in certainty. And that which is uncontrolled can never be certain, either of its own conduct or of its own motives. One of the most difficult things to be certain about is motive. And this brings us to the next phase of our little discussion this morning. We are thinking of the world as will and idea. Now with motive we come headlong into the problem of idea. You will often hear an individual say, I have an idea. Sometimes he has. More often, an idea has him. Some strange, mysterious orchid has blossomed in his subconscious, and he is overwhelmed at its beauty and fragrance. The so-called or alleged idea is important because he had it. If his neighbor had it, it wouldn't be important at all. And if his political opponent had it, it would be treasonable. But because he had it, it is new and wonderful beyond description. And of course he can never conceive that anyone else ever had it, or certainly had it as perfectly as he has, nor will anyone else ever have it again unless he tells them. So all of a sudden, an individual with an idea is like a proud parent whose baby is the most beautiful creature that ever was born. And this idea simply becomes an almost obsessional magnificence. It has come so strangely and wonderfully that it seems to have been immaculately conceived and be the true product of destiny. So an idea arises within us. Now all ideas have risen in somebody. The good ones, the middle class ones, and the poor ones. And at any given moment, unless we are very, very wise, and are therefore inclined to have wise ideas, we never know just how important ours is. Now here's the conflict between will and idea. The moment we have an idea, the will steps in and says, we've got to do something about it. This idea, which is going to change the course of history, must immediately go to work. It must be spread. It must be brought to a waiting world, and that's one of our mistakes. We assume the world is waiting. Actually, the world is composed of a great number of people, each with a little idea of his own, and all waiting to get a chance to use theirs. Now, if our idea happens to be the same as several other people's, we can incorporate it, form a group around it, and perhaps form a social motion, or even a religion, or a political party, or a new scientific discovery, depending on what the idea is. But the fact that we have this wonderful emergence of some kind within ourselves must not cause us to overlook that each emergence of this kind is also a potential emergency that must be faced with great care and judgment. The first thing to do with an idea is to examine it, rather impartially. Examine it as we would expect someone else to if we passed it on to them. This we seldom do. As far as we are concerned, the fact that we had the idea is all the pedigree it needs. Actually, some of the world's greatest tragedies have resulted from some well-intentioned person passing on an immature idea. So we have to study it. What is its value? What is its content? And does this idea represent merely another effort on the part of the will to escape from bondage to that which is reasonable and proper? Is this idea going to be only an excuse now for us to start a tyranny? Are we going to find it essential to our happiness from this point on that other people must accept our idea? Or if they do not, we are just going to be so sad and broken-hearted about it that our whole life will be overshadowed. Or are we going to take this idea out onto a field of tournament and find other people fighting it? And is this going to cause us to say other people are fools? They haven't sense enough to see our idea. If it produces these results, we're all making our own quiet personal contribution to the next world war. So the idea itself, becoming a compulsion in us, drives us often away from this integration that we are trying to build. What we call the idea may be nothing more or less than an escaping neurosis in symbolic form. It may be a carefully and cunningly concealed phobia. It may be the last flashes of autocracy within our own subconscious. It may rise from the atavistic past out of which we have come. Down underneath all of its various veilings, it may be just antagonism, just a prejudice, just a conceit, or even a blind impulse to revenge. It may be almost anything. And the fact that it has a nice-looking front should never cause us to fail to examine the inside of it, to find out whether or not it is a true idea. If the fulfillment or expression or manifestation of this idea is only to be achieved through the violation of some basic law of nature or of the universe, then that idea is not good. If that idea, for its fulfillment, must deprive other persons of the right of having their idea, it is wrong, regardless of how interesting and beautiful it may appear. Now, bad ideas have sometimes lived and flourished for a long time, but they have all ultimately died because they cannot survive the encroaching power of universal law, which is inevitable. Now, many ideas are simply interesting. They don't bother anyone. They're simply fascinating. They're things which make life bright and colorful for us, and where they are constructive and interesting and beautiful and non-competitive, we do not need to worry very much about them. But the individual who is serious and who has perhaps a little tendency to be neurotic is very likely to have dangerous ideas along the way. I know an individual not long ago had a very dangerous idea, the idea of liberty. Now, this idea sounded wonderful because it was seemingly in the very words of Rousseau and Montesquieu. But it was dangerous, because the fulfillment of this liberty impulse that this person had meant the defeat of just responsibilities and the evasion of voluntarily assumed duties. This concept of liberty in this individual, this idea for freedom with all of its trimmings, was simply a sign of immaturity. It had no foundation in validity. Yet this person is now completely possessed by this idea, has poured all their available will and libido into it, and is heading for trouble. So, the moment an idea comes, it must be subjected to the censorship of the total integrated person. He must realize that no matter how hard he struggles, there is always the danger of a traitor somewhere in his own subconscious. There's a saying that no great nation ever fell except by treason from within. A man seldom gets into serious trouble except there be treason within. And this treason within may take the form of perverted will or perverted idea. It comes out like the eternal tempter in an effort to break through man's desire and gradual determination to achieve a state of personal integrity. So as Paul said, whenever we would do good, evil is ever nigh unto us. And in the case of man, the moment the individual attempts to integrate every fragment of negative material is agitated and brought to the surface. This means great discrimination and care, because ideas are things which individuals have to prepare for. They have to build for them. They have to be planned, as in marriage. A happy family must be planned. Ideas must be fitted into purposes. They must have meaning, and they must arise on levels of composure, quietude, integration, and peace. Ideas born in desperation usually lead to desperate results. So the individual who may at any moment of his life be subjected to the dangerous possibility of an idea, might happen any minute, might happen just this minute, must also be in a position to control it, direct it, organize it, and make it fit into the grand purpose of living. Ideas may be created through association mechanisms, something that someone says, something that we read, a picture that we see, a place we visit, may cause an idea to rise to the surface of consciousness. Also, it may rise as the result of our internal ruminations, our meditations, our silent neurotic spells with ourselves, out of the gloom and desperation of tragedy and crisis Sometimes great ideas come. But always we must study them, analyze them, and make sure that the idea is worthy of the individual. For it may arise from some fragment of his personality that does not testify to his full attainment. Ideas, of course, if they are correct and proper, are a priceless bestowal from man's consciousness content. If they represent a true attainment, they probably are the most powerful creative directives that the human being can have. But how are we to know or have any sense of security about the value of an idea? Well, some ideas we test very physically, very ordinarily. We have an idea for a patent. We build the model, the thing doesn't run, so we give up that idea now. But there are many other ideas that we can never check in that way. We never know whether they are going to work or not until we try them in some perhaps critical moment. Ideas as emanations of consciousness are, to a degree, extensions of universal laws into a situation. An idea is a release of archetypal design on some level, in some situation. Whether it relates to the law of gravity or the building of an airplane or the discovery of a new chemical compound, it is rooted in some universal principle and in the workings and factualities of natural law. It is therefore a universal moving into a particular. It is a principle which is seeking to find expression through the mental, emotional structure of a living, rational creature. Under such conditions, the integrity and the merit of the idea will depend, of course, on the level of the being from which it originates. If it originates in the stomach, it is one thing. If it originates in the mind, another. In the heart, a third. And if it originates in consciousness, it is still something else. Ideas, therefore, have levels of origin, and they may arise from normal or abnormal pressures. If, then, we are interested in determining the merit of an idea, we can give it a few very simple tests. One of the tests being, how did it come to us? Did it come to us in a moment of stress? Did it come to us as something incomprehensible? What is the situation which engendered it? And we can determine to a certain degree the answer to this by the motivations which either preceded or accompanied the idea. The individual trying to do something that is not essentially right has an idea of how to do it. Obviously, the idea is not arising from a proper level of understanding. This idea is arising in the emotional nature, on the level of desire, and in the form of some illusion. The man who wishes to rob the bank has a sudden idea of how he can do it. This idea, however, should not be considered as a legitimate expression of his own spiritual content. It is at best an expression of his avarice, his selfishness, or his criminal ingenuity. In the same way, the end to which the idea is directed often reveals its motive. Other ideas can be analyzed and determined by the simple problem as to whether they interfere with the rights of others to have ideas also. If they do, they're wrong. Also, the idea problem is sometimes an escape. We have an idea as to how we can evade something we know we should do. That is a bad idea. So by degrees, our own level of integrity can tell us which ideas are good and bad. But as Hamlet says, aye, there's the rub. Because an idea that satisfies some selfish purpose that we desire to accomplish is seldom analyzed further. That is one wonderful idea. So we carefully protect such ideas as help us to do what we want to do, and observe great caution in applying such ideas as impel us to do what we should do. Thus, unless by will, by integration of nature and consciousness, we have made a working resolution to do that which is essentially right, so far as it is given to us to know the right, until that dedication is made, we have no power to control the consequence of ideas. And even after we make that decision, we must then realize that there will be a flood of ideas attempting to undermine our resolution. Nature, like the unbroken colt, does not wish to be harnessed, human nature particularly. And the individual does not like to impose restrictions upon himself any more than he likes to have others impose them upon him. Yet without certain directives which he interprets as restriction, the average individual cannot live a constructive and useful life. He cannot do exactly what he pleases, because he does not have the courage to please to do that which is right. And as long as this conflict exists, he must exercise control over his own nature, or else bend to the social controls which have been established to protect one individual from another. So ideas must be also carefully studied. And each person who feels that he has one, if this idea is of the kind or type which can have consequence, he should analyze it. Very common problem in this field lies in writing and in drama. An individual has an idea for a play or for a book, and it is a terrific idea. It is ingenious in the extreme, and he is quite certain that if he can develop this theme correctly, he has a marketable product. In other words, this idea will pay off in cold cash. Yet in order to make it pay off, this individual may have to write a book or a play, the content of which may or may not be socially right. In other words, today there is an outstanding lack of responsibility in the field of literature and drama. The play is written to cater to man, not to lead him. It is written to stimulate his most negative and morbid reactions on the ground of what we term today realism. Therefore, the play as a play may do more harm than good, or as a book may actually contribute to the delinquency of other people. So the decision now rests as to which is more important. And I'm afraid that with most persons, the decision would be that the profit is more important and let other people take care of their own morals. Now, actually, they should take care of their own morals. But at this time in society, they cannot. Therefore, knowing this to be true, we have no right to influence them negatively any more than we have a right to influence them positively. We have no right to place them under the glamour of some successful production and cause them thereby to be over-influenced in a direction that is detrimental to themselves and others. So the decision of the rightness of ideas, the decision of the principle and level upon which action will be conducted. This type of decision is the heaviest burden that the will must bear. Because the individual must either will, at first at least, to maintain certain attitudes and proprieties, or they will not be maintained. Later, after he has greater vision, the will is no longer necessary. For where we understand, admire, respect, and love, we do. But in these transitional periods in which other emotions and faculties are not strong enough to preserve integrity, the individual must use a certain native resolution. He must determine upon that which is right and do it. Otherwise, he is bound to be in complications. And out of this comes a certain reflective mood, relating to those who are forever repining, and the individual who is forever embittered by the way life has treated him. Actually, he has broken the rules, whether he knows it or not, whether he intended to or not. He has broken the rules. Now, if he did not intend to break the rules, and broke them by mistake, and learned from his mistake, he probably is not repining too much. Because honest folks who make mistakes expect to pay for them. The individual who, driving his car, drives it badly and dents a fender, expects to have the responsibility of having it fixed. If he does certain foolish things, he knows the probabilities are that he must pay for them. But he does not get terribly neurotic over it. Neurosis depends upon a sense of injustice. And neurotic people are the ones who believe they are suffering without due cause, or that they are paying the penalty of other people's mistakes. Sometimes this is an operation of the law of karma, which may or may not directly seem to relate to the individual. There is an ancient Hindu belief that at any time we force any person to a course of action, we assume moral and spiritual responsibility for every consequence of the thing they do down till the end of time. Now, of course, if we started believing that, we'd get awfully cautious. I told that once to an individual who just loved to have other people do what he wanted them to. And he said, if I believed that, it would really stop me in my tracks. And he thought for a moment, he said it would be even worse than that. Because if that is true, and I had to have such responsibilities till the end of time, I don't know if I could do anything, because nothing that I have recommended am I actually certain of. It just seemed good at the moment, or it seemed to put me in a favorable position of guidance, which is always such a flattering spot. But let us assume for a moment that we have over-influenced people. And as a result of that, they've gotten themselves into all kinds of troubles. By the time, of course, that we get the review of the case, we have 9 evasions for ourselves, and we have talked ourselves right out of all responsibility for what went wrong. But supposing nature has some kind of a way of keeping the records and doesn't accept our excuse, and leaves us responsible for the results of the things we have done. Supposing a certain family wouldn't permit their child to marry. The reason they didn't permit the child to marry was assumedly because they were protecting its interests, but practically because they selfishly wanted to keep the child for themselves. As a result of that failure to marry at that time, what might have proved to be a very fortunate alliance both the girl and the young man in question had their lives affected. In this case, abnormally, because for these young people who cared for each other, to marry would have been the natural and normal thing. On a rebound, the young man marries someone else and has a miserable life. On the rebound, the young girl becomes embittered, does not want to marry, finally leaves home because she can no longer endure the pressure of such parental despotism, and gradually becomes more and more involved in the wrong group of people and ends up an alcoholic. Now, if those parents are responsible, they have a long story ahead of them of the consequences of these happenings, not only directly upon the lives of their children, but upon the lives that their children in turn deflect and distort by the wrong pressures that were brought upon them. Assuming that it will take from 8 to 11 generations to exhaust a neurotic pressure, somebody's going to have an awful big bill, if there's any bill at all. And perhaps it is the answer to the reason why individuals who sometimes seem to have no reason to be unhappy and miserable, and yet have within themselves obviously certain unfortunate traits of disposition, seemingly have more than their share of problems. Perhaps they have, and most of them I know have, tried to exert so much pressure upon other people that this pressure has turned and returned to them again, because they are not aware of the full machinery of the procedure. They consider themselves unjustly treated. But wherever that tendency to dominate, that tendency to be the authoritarian in a situation exists, there also exists neurosis, psychic pressure. The individual is not happy because he is not actually keeping the law of the universe. Each individual then should sit down and give himself a little thought on these matters, because he's going to want to do something as long as he lives. He's going to have the will to achieve or to possess or to accomplish in some way, and to direct that will into a normal, constructive, non-competitive, non-dominating channel is a sign of great maturity of understanding. And to be strong without this strength becoming aggressive is the secret of true strength. For strength is that tremendous power within ourselves that prevents us from an action that is unworthy of us. And when we so interpret strength, we are strong. And we are also in a position then to weigh and analyze ideas, and convictions, and attitudes, and to draw forth out of ourselves a tremendous wealth of creativity. For creativity can never truly express through us until we are honest channels for its expression. If we continue to live in a world of will and idea, we must continue to live according to the best possible uses of these tremendous potentials. And the best possible use of all energy is to make sure that we have a correct adjustment with the laws governing living. Only then can we begin to gain freedom. For freedom is not freedom from law, but freedom from the impulse to break law. The moment the individual is adjusted, the law, as far as a punishing, limiting thing, disappears. Laws exist only for lawbreakers. And man, having found integration within himself, no longer comes into conflict with natural law. Therefore, no longer is subject to the sense of tyranny or this frustration of personal inclination from which so many seem to suffer. Man is never frustrated from doing that which is true. If then he is frustrated, it is because he is overstepping in some way the proprieties of the pattern. And if he so transgresses, he will always be reminded. In the terms of will, the ultimate end of all will is that we shall achieve what in the Scripture is likened to the renunciation of will. The highest attainment of man's spiritual life, perhaps, is summed in the statement, turned in prayer to deity, "Not my will, but thine be done." The individual who has discovered that behind self-will lies the incredible and inevitable energy of divine will realizes also that this terrible struggle which we call life, with its dedications to ignorance, superstition, and fear, that this terrible disaster which we call daily suffering, all of it is rooted in the conflict between mortal will and divine will. The individual, unable to recognize the right of the infinite over the finite. The moment the person is able to experience the reality of the divine will and to know that his own great achievement lies in permitting this divine instrument to move through him to achieve the works of God for man, the moment he realizes this, his entire perspective changes. But he must also be careful not to confuse divine will and mortal will. To most people, their own will is always divine. It's other people who have mortal will. The man who differs from us has mortal will, and he is therefore the enemy of the divine will, which must always be represented by ourselves. This attitude, of course, is most confusing and a bit ridiculous, because I've known many instances of this divine will, so-called, alleged, in individuals. And this will is always willing in conflict with itself. And 3 or 4 persons, all claiming to have divine will, are all attempting to achieve opposite ends. Actually, the divine will only takes over, or is only manifested or released into action when the human will has matured through growth and understanding and has made the voluntary submission of itself. No individual who is selfish can escape from human will. No person who is still concerned primarily with himself, his own happiness, his own misery, his own success, or his own failure, can be an instrument of the divine will. That is, any more than any other such person. For in all human beings, the element of divine will, of course, is present at the root of life. Therefore, the achievement of the divine will comes only when selfishness, arrogance, egotism die, and the individual recognizes that the highest goal of mankind is to become a living channel for the dissemination of universal truth. To achieve this end is important, but the end is not immediate for the majority of human beings. And also, when we suspect that perhaps a little more of the divine is moving through us, it is always well to remember that God does not break his own laws. Therefore, if divine will, apparently moving through us, counsels us to intolerance, fanaticism, selfishness, arrogance, domination, then it is not divine will at all, regardless of what we call it. For the divine will, like the divine manifestation in nature, is always subtle, demanding little, asking nothing, but continually and inevitably moving to the fulfillment of its everlasting purpose. Therefore, in the divine manifestation, if it comes through man, it will come with beauty, with peace, with truth, with understanding, with patience, with love, and with unselfishness. And if these so-called divine outbursts have not in them kindliness, gentleness, understanding, tolerance, and patience, then they do not come from the divine will. They come merely from some submerged neurotic pressure within ourselves. And a great many things that have passed for inspiration have only been neurosis. But it has sometimes taken the world thousands of years to find this out. And along the way, countless misfortunes and tragedies have occurred. So each person has a tremendous and complete and devastating life job in the gradual integration of his own resources, in the directing of his powers, and then gradually refining his attitudes and his appetites until he is able to live true to principle, and at the same time rejoice that others have the same rights, maintaining for himself the inalienable right of voluntary cooperation with the good, and asking from others no more of voluntary cooperation than he deserves by his own conduct, not by his claims or his pretensions. And if gradually students of serious thinking begin to ponder these problems in their daily relationships, they will realize that if they will live well under the control of enlightened will and dedicated ideas, they will so conduct themselves that they will receive voluntary cooperation. But they cannot demand it, nor can they be demanded to give it. Each individual gives according to his understanding and receives according to his understanding. So out of all these various patterns by which we live, the golden age we look for, the better time to come, has always been envisioned as a voluntary cooperation of mankind. And under that pattern only can it come into existence. Peace will come to the world only when men voluntarily unite to cause it. Peace will come in a family only when the members of that family voluntarily give up or relinquish those authoritarian powers by means of which conflict is forever perpetuated. And where it is necessary, the family regains its integration through education and the gaining of a voluntary cooperation through increasing knowledge. But everywhere, man has the right to give himself or to withhold himself according to the convictions of his conscience. On these foundations, then, willpower relaxes and no longer becomes this driving force to control others. And because it is relaxed, we have a better chance to estimate and understand ourselves and do the great, wonderful job of house cleaning that is the sublime opportunity at every man's door. And with this type of thinking, I believe we can solve some pretty practical problems. Time's up. Next Sunday morning, we are going to have a sort of special occasion in the sense that we are going to join with the 350 million Buddhists of the world in a celebration, merely in the form of a discussion, but a tribute to the birthday of Buddha, which is being celebrated in India, Ceylon, Burma, and many other eastern countries. This, according to several calendars by which they calculate, is the 2500th anniversary of Buddha. And Asia is celebrating this occasion. Next Sunday, we will think about the term of Buddha's Sermon on the Mount. After the Buddha had received the illumination at Bodh Gaya, he went along the road and came to a little place that is now called Sarnath, not far from the city of Benares. And here he sat down on a little hillock by the side of the road and preached to the first 5 members of the faith. And this was called his Sermon on the Mount, and was the beginning of a religion which was to influence the world for 2,500 years. So next Sunday we're going to take up the story of his Sermon on the Mount. I'd like to also call to your attention that on Sunday, August 26th, 2 weeks from today, the Friends Committee will hold open house at our headquarters. This will be the only open house during the summer. We hope it will be an opportunity for out-of-towners and close friends to visit our buildings and headquarters. There will be committee members to show friends through the offices. There will be attendance in the library and museum to answer questions, and refreshments will be served. So we thank the Friends Committee for this activity and hope that you will take advantage of it. This afternoon at 2 o'clock, the local study group or headquarters study group will meet at our headquarters and will discuss philosophical subjects. Friends interested in the subject of study group activity or discussion groups in general, or who would simply like to come and see what's going on, are most cordially invited to attend. I would also call your attention this morning, our booklet, Superfaculties and Their Culture, and our book on religious subjects, 12 World Teachers, which will give you a wonderful working foundation for mutual appreciation of the different ideas which have led and spiritualized mankind. This will be good because it will help everyone to realize the wonderful beauty that lies in the right of free worship, and why all the different peoples of the world should be permitted to have their religions, but most of all should also give each other the same right. And in this conviction is a great practice in religion, which is good for all of us. And when we can overcome religious prejudice, for example, in our own minds, we then relieve ourselves of one of the heaviest pressures that burden thoughtful persons. So we thank you all for being with us this morning and hope to see you again next week.